Okay, paragraph 12, entitled Prorations. This is a super important provision of the contract. It's not something that should be glossed over lightly. So this paragraph addresses proratable items. What are proratable items? Well, typically those are taxes, rents, security deposits, assessments. So let's say, for example, a buyer buys a home that's subject to an association. Let's say that buyer closes on March 15th, but the seller has paid for the monthly assessment through the end of March. And what happens at closing is that the buyer then would reimburse the seller from the date of closing through the end of the month, as those fees have been prepaid. Same thing, say, for example, with rents. Let's say a seller has collected rents from a tenant for March. Closing is in mid-March. Well, then the seller would owe the buyer a credit at closing from the date of closing till the end of the month, as the seller had already received those rents. So those are prorations. Those are proratable items. But the crux of this paragraph really deals with real estate taxes. And this is probably one of the most convoluted topics in a real estate transaction. So let's start with the basic premise that taxes are paid a year in arrears. So we're in the year 2025. That means this year everybody will be paying the 2024 tax bill. So in Cook County, tax bills are issued twice a year. The first installment is always due around the beginning of March, and that amount is always 55% of the prior year's tax bill. And in the second installment in Cook County, there's not a date certain on its issuance, but it typically comes out in summer, late summer, June, July, August, although there's been years where that bill comes out in November. In all the other collar counties, taxes are paid in 2 equal installments, and those bills come out in May with due dates of June and September. So if you look at line 147, paragraph 12A, what happens here is that at closing, the seller would tender a credit based on a percentage of the previous year's tax bill. A customary percentage is 105, maybe even 110%. So that means that at closing, the parties will look at the last known tax bill. And in this case, the last known tax bill is the year 2023. Those 2023 taxes were issued and paid in 2024. So we take the 2023 tax bill and we add a proration factor of 105%. And then what will happen is the seller will give the buyer a credit at closing for that amount of the 2024 taxes. Similarly, the seller would owe a credit to the buyer from January 1st of 2025 until the date of closing. So those are your tax prorations. Now, there are situations where 105 or 110% may not be enough. Say, for example, in the city of Chicago, there are triennial reassessments. So properties are reassessed every 3 years. And there are times when assessed values can go up by 20, 30, 50, even 60%. So a proration factor of 110, 105% isn't going to be sufficient. So the parties in attorney review, which will be discussed a little later, can modify the proration factor so that the buyer receives a fair tax credit at closing. Now keep in mind there's also situations, these situations are addressed in 12B, where there's not a prior fully assessed tax bill. So really what we're talking about here is in new construction. So when the parties don't have a fully assessed prior year's tax bill to base any prorations off of, the contract calls that a sum of 3% will be held in escrow until the actual tax bill comes out so the parties can see the exact amount of the bill and then settle up accordingly at that time. 3% always seems to be a little bit on the high side, so this is really a big topic of negotiation and attorney review. But as the contract stands and reads now, that 3% of the purchase price would deposit it in escrow, and when the actual 2024 tax bill comes out in 2025, the parties will pay and settle up out of that escrow with any excess being returned to the seller. So very important provision, not to be glossed over lightly, and that is paragraph 12.